There are some aspects of long-term memory that lend themselves pretty well to illustration, and we'll speak of coding just briefly, and then this idea of retention, duration, and forgetting. This will be probably the longest section that we'll have in chapter 6. Baddeley comes up over and over again, and some of this stuff is pretty old. But Baddeley was arguably the most significant researcher generally on memory that existed after World War II, and he's only died fairly recently. But he demonstrated a phenomenon experiment. He presented participants with lists of words that sounded familiar, such as mad, map, and man, and were matched in word length to a first list, but did not sound alike, like pen, day, and rig. Others saw a list of words with similar meanings, like huge, big, and great, and such words are called semantically similar. In other words, they have a relation between them that suggests that they mean the same thing. And another list of control words that were matched to the third list but did not share any meaning, like foul, old, and deep. Recall, was tested after a 20-minute interval during which participants worked on another task to prevent rehearsal and ensure it would be drawn from long-term memory instead of short-term. The results showed that acoustic similarity produced little effect on performance, like map, man, and mad, but that the list of semantically similar words were harder to learn. Baddeley, in reviewing this and other things, concluding that although it's not absolute, it's roughly true, acoustic similarity affects short-term memory, whereas semantic similarity affects long-term memory. In other words, things that are conceptually alike are more likely to be remembered together, and that's less true for short-term memory. So what about retention duration? How long can we hold on to things, and when might we forget them? And I want to tell you a couple of stories here. There was one sort of lengthy anecdote in your text about Ohio Wesleyan that I'll allude to. Here's another older study, 40 years old now. 700 adults who had taken or were taking a high school or college course in Spanish. So these might be people my age. The participants who were not currently enrolled in a Spanish course and had not studied Spanish for periods ranging from 1 to 50 years. So in the high school case, I haven't taken high school French since 87, so that's 37 years ago. They also varied in their original degree of learning of Spanish. He plotted forgetting curves for different aspects of knowledge of Spanish, for example, grammar recall and other things. And although forgetting differed slightly as a function of measure, the pattern of results was consistent. For the first 3 to 6 years after completing Spanish, their recall declined, but then it leveled off. For the next 3 decades or so, the forgetting curve was flat, suggesting no further loss, and retention showed a final decline after about 30 to 35 years. So what do we make of that? Well, the notion is that large portions of the originally acquired information remain accessible for a long time, in spite of the fact that it's not rehearsed or used. This portion of the information is in sort of a perma-store state, presumably because you've rehearsed it over and over again. So this portion of the information is in a perma-store state. And the method of testing recall versus recognition, is a function of the level of original training, the grades received in Spanish courses, and the method of testing, whether you had to recall it or you could recognize it. But it appears to be unaffected by ordinary conditions of interference. So in that case, it's amazing. I was an indifferent high school student, did not do very well at all. I took French from a very enthusiastic teacher that was fluent, of course. But what I've noticed is that even after all these years, and visiting France only once in 1992, is that I think I could still retain a remarkable amount of things from French. Now, not the most obscure things like, I don't know what the word is, but the imperfect tense, which was hard. That was a very difficult aspect of French, was this imperfect tense. But little things like asking where the bathroom is, like où est la voisine, and what is that? Qu'est-ce que c'est? I mean, it's been 38 years since I've touched any of that, and I'm still pretty good at it. I remember a lot of the basic maxims, like LE for masculine verb, LA for feminine noun, I should say, and those sorts of things. It's amazing how much took root and stayed there forever, even though there's no rehearsal. So I've dropped a good number of things in my youth, but I've retained a heck of a lot. So now they also mention up there in the blue paragraph, recall versus recognition. If I gave your average citizen, lifelong citizen of the U.S., could you write all the U.S. presidents down 1 through 46 in any order? They might get 20 or 25. They'll get Roosevelt and Lincoln, and they'll get the last 8 presidents, Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, and then before that another Bush, and then Reagan, and then Carter and Ford. I'm going to run out of gas eventually. Nixon, Johnson, etc. Kennedy, Eisenhower. So maybe I could get 30 because I happen to enjoy U.S. history, but I'm going to miss Millard Fillmore. I won't remember that. I won't remember Polk or Ulysses S. Grant. A recognition task, on the other hand, is I present people with a list of names and say, hey, was Millard Fillmore a president? Oh, he certainly was. What about Polk? Certainly was. What about Andrew Johnson? Absolutely. What about John Quisenberry? Well, definitely not. We never had a President Quisenberry. So that's recognition, and it's arguably easier, and it doesn't tax memory as much, and therefore we learn less. There was a study on the campus buildings at Ohio Wesleyan. Interestingly, the students recalled the buildings better at first. So the streets were forgotten quickly, but most information about street names was lost after about 10 years. But the names of landmarks and buildings faded more slowly. After decades of graduation, alumni retained about 40% of the information that the graduating seniors had. And that's the case with me. I can remember the buildings on my college campus at the University of Dayton, where I have not set foot in 20 years, and I graduated 31 years ago. So I could still remember the particular buildings that we had to go to, but the street names surrounding, that's a little bit dicier. So who tested these memory ideas? So forgetting or misremembering is a topic that dates back to the earliest days of experimental psychology, including Ebbinghaus, a Prussian psychologist, pioneered the empirical memory of under controlled conditions. And one of the things he did, as you could see here, speaking of sort of flatlining or asymptoting, he noticed that he forgot a lot of nonsense syllables, but sort of settled down into a memory level of about 30, which suggests we have a rapid fall off, but there is some retention that lasts for a good while. And you see he went from saving roughly 100% of what he remembered down to 40, then 30, but basically reaching a threshold or a plateau of about 30%. Which suggests that there is some savings there. There's some retention, even for nonsense syllables that he purposefully designed not to be memorable, to be patently nonsense, and thus less likely to be remembered. So, and you can see how old this is. We're going back to the late 1880s into the early 1900s. So it was one of the first forays into sort of a self-examination. But this might be similar to the Spanish speakers or the Spanish takers' knowledge. You lose a lot, but then there's a certain plateau where you stop losing. As with short-term memory, many psychologists believe that interference, not decay, accounts for forgetting in long-term memory. They believe material that can't be retrieved successfully from long-term memory is there, but it's buried. So, for instance, when I'm trying to remember obscure presidents like Polk or Fillmore or Ulysses S. Grant or John Tyler, our 10th president, the namesake of Tyler, Texas, what happens was when I'm trying to remember those presidents, Trump gets in the way, and Biden and Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and more recent presidents tend to get in the way, and I can't remember those more obscure ones. So that's a difficulty with that sort of thing. So researchers have used this task to study interference in a couple ways. The first is through proactive interference. This term refers to the fact that previous learning can make retention of subsequent learning more difficult. So thus, if a group of participants learns a list of paired associates and then learns a second list with the same set of terms but new second ones, recalling the information from the second list is a little bit harder. And I want to come back with that in the next segment.